Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, this time discussing something a little bit different, something which usually would be saved for my second channel, SHM, and for those who don't know, yes I do have a second channel, a movie review channel, but it's been inactive for probably like 7 or 8 months at least, and for those who might be wondering why, it's because a combination of YouTube demonetization and multiple studios claiming my videos has basically killed the channel. It's just a total waste of time to produce any of those anymore. So I basically just focused in more on this channel, which of course is growing better than that other channel is anyway. So we're doing something a bit different, movie review. I have done movie reviews before on this channel, but this one of course has a more direct relevance to the majority of the audience here, being a car movie, a racing movie. So let's get straight into it then. First of all, the name. This movie has 2 names, depending on where you watch it, either Ford v Ferrari or Le Mans 66. Now, here in the UK, it was still called Ford v Ferrari, and I'm not sure exactly why they would translate it into 2 titles. I guess Le Mans 66 might translate more in Europe, maybe. But I will categorically say that after watching the film, it should not be called Le Mans 66. This is not a Le Mans movie. Don't go into it expecting 2.5 hours of Le Mans, because you will be disappointed. This is a Ford v Ferrari movie. Big difference, because this movie goes way further in scope than just Le Mans. In fact, Le Mans is like the last third of the film, and that's not a spoiler, it's just to set your expectations. That's not to say it's a bad film, though. I actually loved this movie. I will say, of course, many of the things that I loved about it. There's only a couple of tiny things that I could maybe bring up that I didn't like as much, but there was nothing whatsoever that I specifically didn't like about the film. Now, going into this movie, you could enter it as one of 2 potential audiences. And that's not really the case with most movies. Most movies, you go in, you watch a story, there's a hero, there's a villain, etc. And although this movie has elements of that, it's a car movie, and that is a very, very different challenge for a director and a producer and a team of actors, etc. to actually create, because very few fan bases are as fervently vocal as the car community. So if you get something wrong, they know about it. If you do something visually insulting to the cars or their history, they notice it, which is why films like Fast and Furious, Need for Speed, various others like that, Torque, one of the crazier ones, they tend to get bashed a lot by petrol heads because they're just not realistic. Of course, Fast and Furious has just embraced that and gone full superhero. Some others were actually at least trying to be realistic and it still didn't really work, but I'm glad to say that this is more in the category that I would put Rush in. Rush is probably, or was actually, my favourite racing movie. It was a fantastic film, great actors, great rivalry, loved the cinematography, and I loved everything about that movie. It was a great film, and doubtless many of you guys who've seen it as well will love it also. It had kind of an old school vibe. It felt like that older era of racing and driving movies, many of which are legendary. This, I think, is probably my new favourite racing movie. Now, my favourite driving movie is probably still Duel, Steven Spielberg's first movie. If you haven't seen that, check it out. But that's more of a horror film. Whereas this one, I loved it, as I said. But the reasons why I loved it focused in mostly on how grounded it felt, how fantastic Christian Bale is in this movie, and also how James Mangold, who interestingly directed Logan as well, which is one of my favourite movies also, how he directed this film. Because it's very easy to go over the top with a racing movie, regardless of if it's dealing with real life or fiction, old or new cars. It's so easy to let the CGI take over, to try and make the audience more and more excited by having cars do things that they can't do. Of course, the Fast and Furious problem. This movie did not do that for the most part. Now, I said that there are a couple of smaller things that I could take issue with or maybe wouldn't have loved as much as anything else. And one of those, very briefly, was actually to do with those visual effects. Now, I wouldn't necessarily even call it full CGI, because I didn't notice any glaring CGI in this movie, and what I mean by that is any CGI that takes you out of the moment. Of course, they use touch-ups and visual effects all the time, but I'm talking about stuff which is obviously ridiculous, and you can think of movies like that. In this movie, that's not the case. What I did notice, however, a couple of times, especially as cars were going through corners, that they would it seemed speed up the footage a little bit, but not in that kind of old-timey 1940s where everyone talked in black and white and walked fast. I mean, like, sped up footage. Like, it looks wrong. If you know what a GT40 should be taking corners like, you know that it doesn't take corners like that, in other words. So a couple of those occasions were kind of like, that looks a little bit Hot Wheels-ish in terms of how that car took a corner, but none of the important stuff. So the corners, of course, aren't important when you're telling a story. The straight lines look great. The interior shots are fantastic. Of course, the performances are fantastic across the board. The locations, the sets, the cinematography, I loved it. I loved all of it. Now, for those of us who are maybe gaming fans as well, such as many of yourself, Gran Turismo, Forza, whatever your poison is, there are a number of locations in the movie which you'll love to see. Again, not really a spoiler for anyone who isn't a car fan anyway, but of course you've got Le Mans in there. It's kind of in the name. But you've also got Daytona featured, Willow Springs even, which was very cool to see after playing Gran Turismo. It gives you a completely different perspective. And being a car fan, especially being a racing game fan, going into the movie gives you a very unique perspective. Because for the average viewer, there are a lot, and I mean a lot of scenes in this film where you watch it and you're just along for the journey. You have no idea what the circuit looks like. You don't know where you are on the track, because you're just an average viewer. And that's great. That's actually probably beneficial for the director, because he can surprise you. For those of us who are existing car or gaming or racing fans, we know those tracks as soon as we see them. You plop the actor on a particular corner on a particular track, and you know exactly where he is. Willow Springs, for instance, Daytona, you recognise the track, you know where they are instantly. And that was very cool. It's almost like an additional level of Easter egg as a reward for your existing fandom of racing. And that was cool, because the average viewer, a non-petrol head, simply wouldn't get that. But as far as the nitpicks go, as I said, that slight sped up footage through the corners, and it might not just be sped up, it might be maybe the way it was shot as well. The camera maybe follows the car a little bit too tight. I would have liked to maybe see the camera sway a little bit more to kind of enhance the age of these vehicles, because, I mean, these cars did bounce and sway around a lot. It was the 60s after all. But again, it's only a small nitpick thing. And again, the average viewer wouldn't care about that. But the second thing is that it's not so much of a nitpick, but you need to know going into this movie that it is not a fast-paced film. There are fast-paced scenes, but the story takes its time. And there are a lot of people who will doubtless say, it was too boring. The first 45 minutes, it took too long. It was too much business chatter, too many suits, too much conversation. I can understand those nitpicks, but at the same time, that's the story. As I said, this is not a Le Mans movie. It's a Ford v Ferrari movie, and you cannot tell the Ford v Ferrari story without the suits. It's such an integral part of the story that without that at the beginning, you don't get Le Mans at the end. So for those who have issues with the pacing or with the length of the movie, just try and think to yourself why the movie is that length and why the story is told that way, and you'll understand that actually that is probably the quickest amount of time you could have told it in. There are some people who say, you could cut maybe 15, 20 minutes out of the end. I understand that sentiment. There is a natural point in the movie where you think, it could end now, and it would be a good ending, and then it continues on for a little bit more. And although I'm glad that it did, for a different reason, I could see some people maybe not liking certain choices in the film. The ending, for instance, which of course I'm not going to spoil, but as I said, there is a natural point where the film could end, and then it does continue for about 5 or 10 minutes more. So that could be controversial for some people, but I think, again, for racing fans, probably not so much. As far as performances go, well, of course, I already mentioned Christian Bale playing Ken Miles. It's an amazing performance. It's actually one of my favourite performances from Christian Bale, and coming from somebody who pretty much considers Christian Bale to be the best living actor, as far as I'm concerned, I love his performance as Batman. Of course, his favourite performance is probably, or my favourite performance of his, is probably The Machinist, still, which is a very underappreciated film. This one might actually be my second favourite performance of his. And I would put it over Batman, in fact, because Batman is great, but he's playing Batman. It's a character that we all already know, so you go into it with a lot of expectations already immediately met. However, these two, The Machinist and Ken Miles, they're lesser known. in the racing world he's known, but for most people he's not. So for me, I love the accent that he had, because he was a British guy. The accent was convincing, his mannerisms, his body language, he kind of had a lankiness to him, which made him seem kind of taller than he was. And Carroll Shelby in the movie is great as well, who is of course played by Matt Damon. Matt Damon's always great as far as I'm concerned, love the Bourne movies, etc. In this one, I've heard, and I'm not sure if they will go forward with this, that they're going to be pushing for both Christian Bale and Matt Damon in the Oscars. I must admit, I'm not so much behind both of them. I think that Matt Damon is great in the movie, but he is not Christian Bale. Christian Bale is by far the standout of this film, and Carroll Shelby's a cool character, but he's more like the sidelines kind of guy, and he has, of course, an instrumental role in the story, but as far as the performances go, specifically, which of course is what the Oscars are about, not the story, but the performances when it comes to the best actor, best supporting, that kind of stuff, he simply doesn't have as much to do as Christian Bale. It's not as physical for him. It's not as much of a mental battle that's being portrayed. Even some of the physical stuff isn't as intense. So for me, if you're going to give an Oscar to anyone, it should be Christian Bale. And I would be very happy if he did get an Oscar for Best Actor, because it's fantastic. His performance is great in the movie. He carries the entire film, and that's in a film which is already strong enough to carry itself. Now, as far as the music goes, of course, in a racing movie, in a car movie, the music is a very important thing. You can use it to accentuate the existing excitement of a racing scene. You can use it, of course, for emotional beats, as you would in any movie. I would say that the music was good enough for this movie. I didn't actually consider it to be a great score or soundtrack, especially in the racing scenes. I actually noticed the music a couple of times, and I don't usually notice music in films. That's why I often have to go back to actually listen to it. When I notice the music, it's usually not a good thing, because to me the music shouldn't stand out. It should be part of the scene. It should be a character in its own right, and it should forward the scene. It shouldn't detract from it or draw too much attention to itself. However, in this movie, it kind of did a couple of times. It was a little bit almost too modern for me in a couple of times, maybe a decade or two too new in the vibe of the music. I don't know, Rush just didn't do that for me. I like the music in Rush. In this movie, maybe not so much. Again, I didn't dislike the music. I just thought, interesting choice. Maybe I would have liked something maybe a little bit older. Maybe even something a little bit more period appropriate than what this sounded like, and I could be wrong. Of course, it could be period appropriate and I might just be off about that. But as far as overall scores go, well, of course I don't run the scoring system that I had on my second channel for a movie like this, because being on this channel, it's totally different. Car audience, racing fans, you don't need to know what it is out of 5 in a conventional sense like I would with a horror movie. So all I'll say is, I'm not giving the movie a rating as such, at least not officially, but I will say that if you are a racing fan, if you're a car fan, if you're like a Gran Turismo or Forza fan, watch it. You're going to enjoy it. If you're slightly younger, maybe in your early to late teens, you might find that the story drags a little bit at the start. If you're not fully familiar with the story and with the different racing associations like the FIA and the SCCA, you might get a little bit caught up in trying to understand what they're talking about sometimes. But if you're a little bit older, if you're at least, in your 20s, 30s and older for sure, and you are familiar with this already, you'll have a lot of moments where you think, oh, that's cool. And there's actually one pretty nice little Easter egg of a car in there, which I'm not going to spoil. And it's not important to the story, you just see it in the background. So I'll say, when you see a particular scene where they arrive in France, look in the background for a vehicle on the back of a tow truck. It's a nice little Easter egg from Unsung Heroes. But as far as my score goes, if I was going to give it one, it would be probably somewhere around a 4 out of 5, which doesn't sound like a perfect score for me, but that's actually pretty high in my second channel's terms. So overall, check it out if you're a racing fan, check it out if you're a fan of the GT40 versus Ferrari story, and of course, check it out if you want to see a great performance from Christian Bale, because he really is the standout of the film. Overall though, as far as my review goes, that's it. I would love to see your thoughts, of course, down below, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.